Good morning and welcome. My name is Stanley Koblaku and I'm super elated to bring you another compelling episode of China Now, your go-to source for all that is happening in China and the world. Let's get started with China Currents, where Derek is standing by to bring us up to speed on how United States application to study samples of lunar soil brought by China's Sanji lunar mission has once again been denied. We will also get to know about French President Emmanuel Macron's controversial decision against China and how it is adversely impacting French farmers. Derek has more.
China Current is a weekly news talk show from China to the world. We cover viral news about China every week and also give you the newest updates on China's cutting-edge technologies. Let's get started.
Welcome to China Currents, your weekly news report on what's happening in China. I'm Derek. In this episode, U.S. application to study China's moon soil denied again. 3 Chinese astronauts successfully returned to Earth from China's space station. Macron has made a decision against China that makes France farmers suffer. Brazil has replaced the United States as China's top corn exporter. China-India relations back on track. First, let's look at why U.S. has failed to apply China's lunar soil. On 1st of November, Chinese scientist Wang Junqiang from the Ningbo Institute of Technology, Chinese Academy of Sciences, reported the U.S. has once again requested samples of lunar soil from China, but this request has been not approved once more. The obstacle preventing U.S. access to these samples is a U.S. law enacted 30 years ago that imposed sanctions on China. As noted by SpaceNews.com, the U.S. efforts to study China's lunar soil began with an internal email in late 2023, which highlighted the unique value of the Chinese lunar samples, according to the Chinese media outlet Guancha. So what makes China's lunar soil so unique? The first batch of lunar soil was collected by the Chang'e 5 spacecraft in 2020 from an area of the moon that had never been visited by humans, making it exceptionally valuable for scientific research. For instance, during Putin's visit to Beijing in 2022, 1.5 grams of this lunar soil was provided to Russia as a research sample. In October of this year, Russia scientists discovered 2 unique crystals within the sample, indicating geological activity on the moon that had never been observed before. The U.S. likely submitted yet another request for lunar soil samples due to recent findings by Chinese scientists who discovered water within the new sample. In June, China's Chang'e 6 spacecraft successfully landed on the far side of the moon, marking the first time humans have collected samples from the region, returning with approximately 2 kilograms of specimens. An August research report stated that China has found a new method to utilize lunar soil for large-scale water production, and Professor Wang Junqiang, mentioned earlier, was one of the project's participants. According to Chinese official media, by studying Chang'e 6 lunar soil samples, researchers at the Chinese Academy of Sciences found that the lunar soil has stored large amounts of the hydrogen due to billions of years of radiation from solar wind. When heated, the hydrogen reacts chemically with the iron oxides in the minerals, producing elemental iron and significantly quantities of water. When the temperature rises above 1000 degrees Celsius, the lunar soil melts and the water generated from this reaction can be released as water vapor. 1 ton of lunar soil can produce approximately 51 to 76 kilograms of water, which is equivalent to over 100 bottles of 500 military bottled water. This is basically enough for 50 people for one day. In response to the discovery made by Chinese scientists, NASA Administrator Bill Nelson was quoted by Reuters stating that water found on the moon could be utilized to produce hydrogen rocket fuel for further exploration of Mars and other destinations. The moon's gravity is only 1/6 that of Earth's, meaning that the same type of rockets launched from the moon could carry 6 times more payload than those launched from Earth. Major discoveries on the far side of the moon have undeniably given China a significant advantage in the space race. Interestingly, American scientists are limited in their access to this unique sample due to a U.S. law known as the Wolf Amendment. Enacted by the U.S. Congress in 2011, the Wolf Amendment prohibits NASA from using government funds for direct bilateral cooperation with the Chinese government or affiliated organizations. At the time, the U.S. cited concerns about the nature and goals of China's space program as the rationale for this legislation. However, for Chinese researchers, the Wolf Amendment is seen as a betrayal. On the same day the amendment was issued, the U.S. Space Shuttle Endeavour completed its final mission, and NASA canceled press that had been promised to all Chinese journalists. Ironically, according to Forbes, Chinese scientists played a key role in building essential components of Endeavour's 2 billion payload, the Alpha Magnetic Spectrometer. It is a space-based detector designed to study the universe and its origin. It is also the unique magnetic spectrometer on the space station and will operate on the ISS for its lifetime. 13 universities and research institutes from China contributed their wisdom and funds to this project. However, when NASA thanked them on its official website, it marked China and its Taiwan province separately. These Chinese researchers may never have thought that the fruits of their intellectual labor would eventually become propaganda materials used by the United States to divide their motherland. This kind of racial discrimination, which both want to exploit the intellectual resources of the Chinese and attack China, has deeply hurt the Chinese people. Now it's China's turn to reject the application from the United States. In addition, in the paper on the Alpha Magnetic Spectrometer published by all the researchers, Petro Levchenko, a Russian scientist with a permanent address at the Petersburg Nuclear Physics Institute, is included. However, on NASA's official website, the contributions of all Russian researchers have been omitted, and no Russian universities or research institutes are marked on the map in the acknowledgements section. However, on the website operated by the European Space Agency, you can still find the original version and the markings of Russian research institutions on the acknowledgements map. China isn't looking to take on the responsibility of leading humanity to become an interstellar civilization by itself. In June, Russia officially joined China's International Lunar Research Station project, which also includes participation from 11 other countries, including Egypt, South Africa, Pakistan, Serbia, and Venezuela. Chinese scientists have successfully tested the technology for making bricks from lunar soil and plan to use traditional Chinese mortise and tunnel joints in the base's construction. The lunar base is expected to be up and running by 2036. If NASA can convince Congress to repeal the Wolf Amendment by December 2035, they might just make it in time for the lunar base's opening ceremony, if they still remember how to get American astronauts to the moon by then. Well, maybe China would still be willing to provide some humanitarian relief if NASA would ask for it. On 4th of December, China's Shenzhou 18 crew have returned home and successfully landed at the Dongfeng landing site in North China after more than 6 months in space. According to China Manned Space Agency, astronauts Ye Guangfu, Li Cong, Li Guangsu were all in good health. The trio lived on board China's Tiangong space station since April of this year and concluded their mission on 3rd of November. Before returning home, they greeted the incoming Shenzhou 19 crew members aboard the Tiangong on October 30. Chinese state media released a video showing 3 astronauts Cai Xuzhe, Song Lingdong, Wang Haoze entering Tiangong space station shortly after docking. The 6 astronauts hugged each other and exchanged cheerful greetings. But their neighbor might not be as delighted as they are. 2 NASA astronauts, Sunita Williams and Barry Wilmore, are stranded on the International Space Station for almost 5 months, despite initially planning to stay just 8 days. In September, their defective Starliner returned to Earth, leaving them awaiting the scheduled return in early 2025. At the press conference for the Shenzhou 19 manned mission, CNSA spokesperson extended his well wishes to the stranded American astronauts on the space station and wished the 2 astronauts a safe return. Except the US astronauts, the France farmers may also want their president to get back to the ground as soon as possible. On 3rd of November, China's Minister of Commerce Wang Wentao met with French Minister Delegate for Foreign Trade in Shanghai. During the meeting, two sides held discussions on recent China-EU trade frictions. On 29th of October, the European Union decided to increase tariffs on Chinese-made EVs to as much as 45.3%. According to AFP, Germany, Hungary, and 3 other countries voted against the tariff hike, while 10 countries, including France, supported it, and 12 countries abstained. France's stance has puzzled many in China, especially as France is once again serving as a guest country of honor at the China International Import-Expo, with over 100 French companies participating, the highest number among EU countries. As early as July, the European Commission had already made a preliminary ruling on the bill to increase tariffs on Chinese EVs. The Chinese Ministry of Commerce has announced to impose temporary anti-dumping measure on imported brandy originating from the EU. According to Investing.com, following China's decision, shares of Rémy Cointreau fell by 5%, while Pernod Ricard dropped by 2.9%. LVMH, the parent company of Hennessy, also saw a 4% decline in its stock. According to AFP, on 17th of September, around 800 people gathered in Cognac to protest, urging EU officials to postpone the vote on tariffs for Chinese EVs. This was the first protest by French cognac producer since 1998. In the December of 1998, the final Peugeot 205 rose off the assembly line more than 15 years after production began. It was being one of Europe's best-selling cars in the late 1980s and early 1990s. If French automakers were still as enterprising and creative today as they were in 1998, would Macron make the same choices when confronted with the Chinese electric cars as he does today? Whatever Macron's answer, French vintners and farmers have already become part of the price. Like the French farmers, the American farmers have also been victimized by their president. China International Import-Expo opens in Shanghai on 5th of November, and over the past few years, the food and agricultural portion has become one of the event's most heavily trafficked in terms of floor coverage and the number of exhibitors, and a clear trend in recent years is that China is diversifying its importers of agricultural products. For example, Reuters reported on 1st of November that Brazil has replaced the United States as China's top corn exporter. Until 2018, China was the largest importer of US soybeans and corn. However, since Donald Trump declared a trade war against China and imposed tariffs on over $300 billion worth of Chinese importers, Beijing levied a 25% tariff on US agricultural goods as a response. Consequently, China redirected much of its sourcing to other agricultural nations like Brazil and Russia. Data from customs reports show the results of this diversification. The share of soybeans imported from the US dropped from 40% in 2016 to just 80% this year, while imports from Brazil increased from 46% to 76%. Similarly, after only a year of approving Brazilian corn, Brazil has already replaced the US as China's top corn supplier. Moreover, as in 2018, it remains unlikely that US agriculture would be able to secure enough alternative markets to offset these losses. USDA senior economist Sean Arita disclosed that the last trade war between the two nations cost US agriculture over $27 billion, losses that were ultimately mitigated by government aid. However, those years were exceptionally challenging for growers, and the long-term impact of the trade war meant that the US ceded its share of the Chinese market to Brazil. According to a forecast released this month by the US National Corn Grower Association and the Soybean Association, a renewed US-China trade war could slash American soybean exports to China by roughly 15 million tons annually, a decrease of over 15%. Corn exports are projected to drop by 2.2 billion tons if China imposes new retaliatory tariffs in the new round of trade conflict. These losses in US agricultural sectors could grow even larger. On 25th of October, Zhang Xinwang, Vice Minister of Agriculture and Rural Affairs of China, announced at a press conference that China's grain output has consistently exceeded 650 million tons over the past 9 years, and is expected to surpass 700 million tons for the first time this year. Obviously, this time, if the US tries to torture the Chinese like they tortured the Soviets by restricting food exports, the ones who will suffer will only be themselves. Compared with the United States, India has recently shown more pragmatism and wisdom in geopolitics. On 31st of October, news about India and Chinese soldiers gathering at the border to celebrate the Indian festival of Diwali got attention in China. Since 2020, when the bloody clash in the Galwan Valley resulted in 4 Chinese and 20 Indian fatalities, the border friction between China and India has hardly stopped. However, recently, the incident suddenly reached a turning point. In October, during the 2024 BRICS summit held in Russia, China and India reached resolutions on issues concerning the border areas through diplomatic and military channels. According to the Press Trust of India, on 30th of October, China and India completed a disengagement exercise at the Depsen and the Demchok friction points along the LAC in eastern Ladakh. Future discussions on resuming border patrols are scheduled at the local commander level, indicating a commitment to reducing tensions on both sides. When the agreement was just reached, the Chinese people were happy that the soldiers from both sides could finally go home, but they also had doubts about India's commitment. This is because due to the religions and the cultural diversity in India, the Chinese has always doubted how far New Delhi's will can be conveyed from the Sino-India border. However, on the day of Diwali, one piece of news gave the Chinese people great confidence. That is, Chinese and Indian soldiers exchanged candies together and celebrated the festival together. In India, it symbols the spiritual victory of light over darkness, good over evil, and knowledge over ignorance. This is a very good sign. China and India has both ancient civilizations that have been neighbors for thousands of years, with a long history of cultural exchange. For example, one of China's 4 great classical novels, Journey to the West, tells the story of a Chinese emperor sending someone to India to introduce Buddhist scriptures. There are no fundamental conflicts of the interest between China and India. It was only when British colonizers hastily left Asia, disrespecting Asian history, religions, and cultural backgrounds, that they arrogantly and irresponsibly drew lines on the map, providing an excuse for those with ulterior motives to sow discord among Asian unity. Now, driven by the common good of all mankind, there is a hope that China, India, and all BRICS countries will once again share a sweet future. That's all for today. Thank you for watching this episode of China Currents. If you have any thoughts or comments, please reach us at the email address below. We look forward to hearing from you. See you next time.
Now, up next is Global Arena with Zhang Wenwei, who is Director of China Institute at the Fudan University. He'll be speaking with Yanni Varoufakis, former Greek finance minister and renowned economist.
I remember you were once asked in an interview if you were again to become Greek finance minister today, would you do it differently from the past? And your answer was very blunt. You said, I would be far less pliant and far less diplomatic vis-a-vis the EU and vis-a-vis Berlin. Yeah. As our topic today is whither Europe or whether Europe is heading, we think no one is better qualified than you to speak on this subject. Maybe we could have a dialogue. This very idea, EU as a design of the United States, is not very well known in China. For instance, I'm thinking of this with the rise of Euro for a time. And many people thought it's the Europeans' identity to show we're different from the United States. We need to have economic autonomy. And some people even say that the very breakout of the war, Kosovo War, was in one way or another the US attempt to destroy the euro. And another thing is the very cause of this war against Iraq, Saddam Hussein, had to do with Saddam Hussein's decision to use euro to sell its oil. So do you think this is a fair assessment, or it's completely wrong from your point of view, as the EU's relations with the United States more boss and vassal state, this kind of structure? Yeah.
It's an interesting hypothesis. I believe it's more complicated than that. And allow me to explain why is it more complicated. Look, the Americans didn't want to destroy the euro. The Americans were skeptical about the euro. They were saying to Europeans, what are you doing? You want to federate? Federate. But don't federate your money. Because the Americans are, whatever you may say about them, at least they are smart. And they are more practically minded. And they think globally. Germans do not think globally. They were at the time, you see, the German mindset, you have to understand, I appreciate it. They just didn't want to be a global power again because of the trauma of the defeat of Nazi Germany. They wanted one thing, and I think Chinese people understand that. They wanted to be the workshop of Europe. They wanted to make good washing machines and you know, great propellers for your ships here in the shipyards. They wanted to make electronics. They wanted to make pharmaceuticals. They wanted to build things and make money out of that without dominating Europe or the world. You know, that's not a bad thing. The problem is that this means you don't have an understanding of the macroeconomic conditions under which you can do it. You know, you have to, under capitalism, you need to worry about where the demand will come. Because the problem that capitalism has, as Marxism has taught us, is that it produces under-consumption. Now, from 1945, or at least 1949, 1950, all the way to the mid-1970s and beyond, the United States created the conditions for German cars and German pharmaceuticals and German chemicals to have markets. The Germans didn't have to think about it. The Americans were managing global aggregate demand. At some point, especially after 2008, that was no longer the case. And the Germans continued not to care about managing the macroeconomy. They thought that somehow, if they produce good things, good manufactured goods, they will sell magically on the basis of how desirable they are. That's simply not understanding how capitalism works. So the Americans were looking at the euro thinking, this is going to be a problem for you folks. Think about it carefully. I have spoken to, for instance, an interesting conversation I had with Jack Lew, L-E-W. Jack Lew was the finance minister, the US Treasury Secretary of Barack Obama. He was very, very angry with Europeans, not because they had the euro, but for the same reasons I was angry with Europeans, because they were practicing austerity for the many while printing money for the many. Now, I was, from a left-wing perspective, angry with what Europe was doing. He was from an American perspective, because he understands that a Europe which was imposing austerity on the German working class, essentially is pushing American industry to boost its net exports to the United States, and therefore to export unemployment to the United States. So the American government was very angry with the European Union. One reason for the Ukraine war, one reason for essentially turning against Europe by Washington, D.C., was that the Americans wanted to teach the Europeans, and particularly the Germans, a lesson. You cannot continue to export unemployment to the United States, but just because you're not doing the right thing by your own people. And now they have won, because now the German government is completely in a state of panic. You mentioned Saddam Hussein. Let me say something about that. I don't believe that the United States invaded Iraq in the first Gulf War because of anything to do with currencies. what happened was, remember, it was 1991. As I was saying before, the difference between the United States authorities and the European authorities is the United States authorities are good Marxists. Not in favor of the working class, but they think in Marxist terms. They understand that capitalism produces underconsumption, and American capitalism is constantly running the risk of not having enough aggregate demand for its products, right? So it's essentially Das Kapital turned upside down. How to use Das Kapital against the working classes of the world. But still, it's a Marxist way of thinking about it. So in 1991, the Cold War ended. If you look at the national accounts of the United States up until 1990, 1989, 1990, the military-industrial complex of the United States, and in particular, the industry that produces ammunition, cruise missiles, Pershing missiles, were accounting for up to 8% of GDP. 8% of national income was accounted for by the production of these weapons. Now, you've got to understand, and I'm sure you do, that Congress, you know, the establishment, is not united. There are some senators that represent the armaments industry, the military-industrial complex. There are other senators who represent the medical establishment, the insurance companies, medical insurance companies, the pharmaceutical companies. Now, they didn't want the money to be spent on missiles. They wanted it to be spent on them. Whenever the Pentagon brought to the Senate or to the House a bill saying we need 100 billion more, 200 billion more, 1 trillion more, they were senators who were saying no because they were representing other interests. So it's not a unified thing. While the Cold War lasted, nobody dared in the Senate speak out against the Pentagon budget. But when the Soviet Union collapsed, they did. They said, hang on a second, we no longer have an enemy. Why do we need more missiles? Why do we need more ammunition? So this is my speculative theory, that in 1991, remember there was a major recession in 1991 in America. There is a very strong causal link between the reduction in expenditure on armaments with that recession. And they needed to start spending again. Now, of course, their warehouses were full of ammunition. How do you go to the Senate and say, we need more ammunition when you've got so much? You need to spend it. So they invaded Iraq. Not only did they invade Iraq, but remember, Saddam Hussein was working for the United States. He was an ally of the United States. When Saddam Hussein, in the context in the 1980s of the war between Iran and Iraq, accidentally hit an American naval vessel and killed many American soldiers, Dick Cheney, who was working for Reagan at the time, flew to Saddam Hussein to pat him on the back and say, we know it was an accident, and to hug and be friends. So people forget that Saddam Hussein, like Noriega in Panama, was a stooge of the CIA. He worked on their behalf. He unleashed that cruel war against Iran on behalf of the United States against Ayatollah Khomeini, right? So he was their man. So they decided, okay, we sacrifice him. So they gave him a signal to take Kuwait. And why did he want to take Kuwait? Because the war that he had waged against Iran, on the orders of the United States, had been financed by Kuwait, on the orders of the United States. So the United States had said to Saddam Hussein, invade Iran, and they had said to Kuwait, give Saddam the money. Right? And when that war ended and 1 million people died, the Kuwaitis said to Saddam, give me the money back. And Saddam picked up the phone and said to Washington, what do you mean? I've done this on your behalf. All these people who have died. And the Americans said, oh no, we don't care. This is between you, bilateral problem that you have with Kuwait. So he gets really cross. And he stands, Kuwait is a pipsqueak thing like that. I'll take it. And the Americans, through the American ambassador in Kuwait, signaled to Saddam on purpose, provoking him. They said, the United States will not have a problem if you take Kuwait. So he takes Kuwait. And then, bang! And if this is all established fact, after the surrender of Saddam Hussein during the first Gulf War, the American Air Force was shooting Pershing and cruise missiles and all sorts of missiles into the desert to get rid of the stock so they could replenish it. At some point, Saddam Hussein gets really annoyed and says, I'm going to redenominate the Iraqi oil in euros. And that's when the Americans decided, okay, we'll take him out. So you're right, but there is a longer story which connects to the question of the crisis of American capitalism, European capitalism, and how this all interconnects.
The financial crisis of 2008 in the United States with all the global implications. So what you said is roughly this particular crisis of 2008 to capitalism is almost like 1991 to the Soviet Union. Do you make this analogy or comparison in a very broad philosophical sense, or it's very concrete that can be, list 1, 2, 3, 4 very similarities there? So I'd like to hear your views on that powerful statement. Yeah.
Both.
Yeah.
Because if your philosophical statement is not backed by concrete analysis, then it's not worth anything. And if the concrete analysis makes sense, then there has to be a philosophical overarching argument. Look, capitalism would have died a long time ago, in 1929, if it wasn't for the Second World War. The Second World War essentially saved capitalism by saving American capital. In combination with Roosevelt's New Deal, essentially what happened was central planning saved capitalism. The war allowed the politics to coalesce around a central plan. And then after the war, capitalism was given another lease of life by extending the American central plan in the way that I described during my lecture in Europe and in Japan. And that essentially extended the life of capitalism all the way to the 1970s. That system died when America lost its surpluses. And then capitalism was given another major boost by completely reversing the surplus recycling mechanism that the Americans had created between 1944 and 1971. Remember that between 1944 and 1971, the Americans had a surplus. The money that they were making from the surplus they were giving to Europe and Japan. That was what's happening up until 1971. After that, the Americans had a deficit, which they used to suck into the United States the surplus of Germany, of France, of Japan, and then China. This is what kept capitalism alive. Chinese savings, Japanese savings, profits were created in this country, and in Japan, and in Germany. But it was a kind of symbiosis, because your factories could work fast and well because you had demand from the Americans who didn't have the money. So they printed the money and they gave it to the German capitalists, to the Japanese capitalists, to the Italian capitalists, to the Chinese capitalists, who then did what with the money? They took it to Wall Street. So the recycling gave capitalism its most exuberant, dynamic phase, what we call globalization. Right? It was all globalization, because Bretton Woods was global too. But this is globalization with financialization and anarchy, complete anarchy, because it is the bankers who are doing the recycling, and the governments do not have the control that they used to, at least the American government, or the German government. You remember, in the International Monetary Fund, that was serious discussions they were having up until 1974. They would get together in Washington and decide amongst themselves exchange rates. They were not leaving it to the markets. So after that, it was not anarchic, but an interesting recycling mechanism, which was based on a really non-neoliberal, anti-neoliberal, and anti-capitalist notion. The idea that the whole thing is run on the basis of the American deficit. Without the American deficit, global capitalism would die. This is what I say in this book, which you very kindly brought here the global minotaur. This is what I say about the minotaur is the American deficit, which needs to be fed by everybody else to keep the world capitalist economy in a kind of unbalanced equilibrium. 2008 was the new 1929. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, and that simply accelerated this recycling mechanism, which I call the Minotaur. So 1991 was the end of Soviet communism and Eastern European communism. 2008, the new 1929, this time, I believe, killed capitalism. Because the American political system, which gave capitalism an extended life during the war, in 1945, in the 1970s, after 2008, I don't believe they can do it anymore. I do not believe that capitalism can be given another new lease of life by the American political establishment. You can see, they're dysfunctional. They cannot build nuclear submarines. Take a train from New York to Washington. It doesn't work. It breaks down. You have to go and get out and walk. America has lost its capacity. The American state has been hollowed out. Yeah. They cannot build bridges. They used to be able to, really very well. Okay? So the American state can no longer manage world capitalism. And in addition to that, going more into the roots of the capital accumulation process, and this is the topic of my last book, which you kindly mentioned, Techno-Feudalism, totally spontaneously, completely unplanned, a new form of capital has been born, what lives in here, with the Googles, the Metas, the Apples, and so on. So you have it too. The only two countries that have it, the United States and China, with Bilibili, with WhatsApp, with Baidu, and so on. But in the West, this capital is completely without control, without political supervision, and it has a fantastic capacity to create new fiefdoms, a new form of feudalism, which is digital feudalism. I call it techno-feudalism. And even though capital has triumphed, capitalism, and that is the main hypothesis of my book, has already been transformed without us even realizing it into a form of techno-feudalism. So in that sense, I'm saying that 2008 was to capitalism that which 1991 was to Soviet communism, its end.
I got your message, yeah. I think it's a very philosophical as well as also a down-to-earth approach to this analysis. Now, I'm thinking of this very issue you mentioned, actually this kind of recycling of the US money, by Germany, Japan, later China. It had to do with the way the Chinese embraced globalization. And here I can add a footnote, because at that time I was working in the Chinese government, having the chance to meet with many Chinese leaders. Actually, within Chinese leadership, there also debate about this, how to face with this globalization. Basically, at that time, Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping has a thinking more or less like this. We cannot continue the Soviet model. This within the Soviet socialist camp, you traded with each other. Mm-hmm. That will not be internationally competitive. Mm. So basically, we have to have relations with the capitalism, with this globalization pushed forward by the United States. But here at that time said a famous phrase in Chinese called the 趋利避害, which literally means maximize its advantage and minimize or ward off its disadvantage. Yeah. Yeah. So more specifically, at that time, the United States pushed this, what we call the comprehensive globalization. It's both economic, political, financial, privatization, democratization, whatever, liberalization, etc. So Deng Xiaoping argued that for economical liberalization, yes. Political liberalization, no. But Gorbachev embraced both, and he failed. Even for the economic globalization, we should also adopt same approach, a critical approach. In the areas where China has more confidence, say we have relatively low labor costs, we have relative other conditions, so we are more open. But in other domains, for instance, capital market, we have been very cautious on that because we're not sure that will work.
It
So-
will never work.
Yeah, you're right. So with that approach, China has managed to be one of the very few countries on the whole, you may say the winner or partial winner of this globalization. So even up to today, most Chinese, both the grassroots and top level leadership, still think globalization is on the whole a positive thing. We are beneficiary from the process. As a result, China has become better and richer and prosperous than before. Yet there is the downside, a cost to this as well. So look at China today. When you talk about the 2008 crisis, some people say in 1989, China saved socialism. In the year 2008, China saved capitalism.
It's correct.
Yeah.
It is
And
correct.
so now again, the West is in crisis, United States is in crisis. We have already written, many of us written this on this argument. We cannot save the United States again. We will not do that. Same with the central government, because U.S. senior officials came to China, urged China to buy their treasuries. We actually sell more and more, obviously.
I'm saying this because we have students here.
Yeah.
Don't think in terms of black and white about globalization. This is or good thing or a bad thing. Before you go anywhere near globalization, you've got to firstly to define what it is. Do we mean intensified international trade? That's always a good thing. Yeah, it's always a good thing to trade more. But that's not what globalization is. Globalization, the way I understand it, which comes out of the 1970s, is the total unhinging of financial power, allowing money to rule the world. That's what globalization was. Essentially, power shifted. In a way, if you want to think of the transformation of feudalism to capitalism, power shifts from landowners to the owners of factories. To put it bluntly, the owners of capital. From the owners of land to the owners of capital, right? That's the great transformation from feudalism to capitalism. Then, with financialization, you have another transition from the owners of capital to the bankers. The bankers were supposed to be the servants of capital. But with globalization, they became the masters of the universe. With one press of the button, they could destroy two countries at once by taking billions and billions from one country, from, let's say, the United States, hollowing out whole manufacturing areas, destroying the working class there, and throwing the money into Korea, right? And then when the bubble bursts in Korea, they press the same button and the money leaves Korea, and Korea is destroyed in 1998. That exorbitant power of the money men, that's a terrible thing. But we must not conflate that with trading.
On this point, China is fortunate.
Yeah, that's why I'm saying that. Yeah. People say to me, people from the right, from the establishment in New York and London say, but Yanis, why are you so against globalization? It has lifted so many billions of people out of poverty. I said it lifted the Chinese out of poverty because they did not globalize because of the capital controls. Because they didn't listen to you, folks. If they had listened to you, if China had listened to the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, and you had liberalized your capital markets, you would have been a desert now. You have been, in 1998, you would have been destroyed, right? China would not be what it is today.
So look at China today. When you talk about the 2008 crisis, some people say in 1989, China saved socialism. In the year 2008, China saved capitalism.
It's correct.
Yeah.
It is
And
correct.
so now again, the West is in crisis, United States is in crisis. We have already written, many of us written this on this argument. We cannot save the United States again. We will not do that. So my final question is, how, if you are to give advice to the Chinese government at this particular moment, what advice you would give in terms of at least economic relations, financial relations vis-à-vis the United States?
China saved capitalism in 2008. Central banks, Western central banks and China, simply by boosting your investment rate so high, you created demand for their goods. So, Germany, that lost the Greek market, the Italian market, the French market, because Europe collapsed. If they were not selling to you, folks, if they were not taking advantage of the growth here because of the accelerator or multiplier effect of this boost in investment here, Germany would have died much, much earlier. So it's correct. You cannot save capitalism again because capitalism has committed suicide in the West. And intentionally, right? The combination of bankers and big tech and what I call cloud capital, they're not even interested in saving capitalism. Why should you save capitalism? My concern for the future is twofold. It comes in two dimensions. One is war, because the Americans are determined to pursue never-ending wars, the same way that they invaded Iraq in 1991 in order to boost aggregate demand. They fear China, and they fear China because here you have developed digital capital, cloud capital as I call it, in conjunction with your finance. I call it cloud finance. You have a cloud finance here, which the Americans don't have. They have the rickety, old-fashioned dollar payment system, which is not digitized because, not because they can't do it technologically, but because Wall Street does not want to share the profits with Silicon Valley. So the Americans worry that your digital payment superhighway will undercut the dollar payment superhighway or highway, and that is where the power comes from today. Not so much from the military, but from the dollar. So they will keep squeezing China in order to prevent, they want to terrorize Indonesians, Malaysians, Africans, Germans, even Chinese. They want to terrorize everyone so as not to use the Chinese digital payments superhighway. Okay, that's my view. And they are prepared to go all the way to nuclear war for that. Because you've got to remember, the American establishment are, in the same way that you have all this gun violence, it's a very violent society. I actually love America. I've lived in America. I think they're very strange people, but most of them are lovely people. And they have many human qualities. But the American regime is violent, deeply violent. Have you seen the cruelty with which they attack their students on campuses? In the 1960s, the anti-Vietnam War. Today, the way they imprisoned their own people. Half of the Americans live in prisons. It's a violent society. They would use nuclear weapons against California to maintain the East Coast's global dominance. So that's why I'm exaggerating a little bit, but not much, to make the point that why I'm worried about nuclear war. That's the one thing I'm worried about. The second thing I'm worried about is I don't want China to become a new Germany. I saw how Germany, I explained that before, didn't manage the macroeconomic environment and kept believing that it could export its way out of domestic trouble. Because if you increase your manufacturing investment, but in a way where you are making yourself dependent on exporting the manufacturing products, then you are becoming more dependent on the United States deficit, like the Germans did. And then either you're going to have to impose austerity and to cut down, and maybe then that will create social cohesion problems in China. So I would like to see a 5-year plan for boosting, effectively giving people money in this country. I would do it really very simple. You have the digital renminbi. Give every Chinese citizen a digital bank account with your central bank, and put a sum of money in everybody's account without any conditions. Take it and spend it to increase the consumption rate in order to create domestic demand, so as not to trade, but to have net exports, to have surpluses. I'm sure the Chinese authorities are thinking about that, but I think you need to be more radical in your way of thinking. My idea of a basic income sounds radical, but you know what? It would really help domestically. And you know what? The people of Europe, the people of the United States, who are being constantly bombarded with anti-Chinese propaganda, if you did that, something like that, they would say, hang on a second, they're giving money away to the Chinese people. And they're taking everything from us. That will be the most important propaganda coup by China, while balancing your national accounts and your macroeconomy.
I'm aware that you are going to meet Shanghai's financial authorities tomorrow. It's a pity. I'll be in Beijing because Shanghai has been singled out as the only metropolitan city in China to be a new financial center for Asia, for the world, whatever. So this authority knows everything, and you should tell your advice to them face to face tomorrow.
And it's a wrap on today's edition of China Now. Please share with us any comments or suggestions you may have for the coming episodes of the show through the email provided below. My name is Stanley Koblaku, and I'll see you same time next week.